It's a real pleasure for me to introduce two of my colleagues who work with me at the University of Roehampton and who I've known for quite a long time now. Joe for a very long time, and I think Lisa mentioned he was once a member of our theatre company. He didn't put that on his CV, I noticed. Sometimes I do. So Joe is Professor of Drama, Theatre and Performance at University of Roehampton. And he's, I think one of the big project he may be talking about is some work he's done with a very well-known Italian theatre company, Società Raffaele Sanzio. And I think that's going to be more... That's exactly what I'm talking about today. But first of all, it's Tery O'Connor, who is a performer with, I think as Lisa mentioned, one of the longest-standing sort of theatre companies in the UK now, Thought Entertainment, who become very much, I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing for them, like kind of almost like textbook figures within the history of British contemporary performance, which comes with its disadvantages and its advantages.
I think we are indeed on the A-level syllabus.
They are.
Oh my God! Is that Coach we should know?
But Terry's been making work, and that ensemble is basically the same core group of people who've been together for almost 30 years now. But Terry, you've recently become Professor of Theatre at the University of Sheffield.
I've recently become Professor of Contemporary Theatre and Performance Practice.
And a couple of years ago joined us at Roehampton as one of the last AHRC Creative Fellows in the Performing Arts, which was a scheme that actually got me into academia in the first place. This was it's almost like a kind of strange artist-in-residence type position, but within an academic institution in which you get 3 years to kind of do what you like. Tery, but this was cancelled 2 years ago. But Tery is now on a 5-year project. It's called Say the Word, which I think are you going to talk about?
I am going to talk about it.
So I don't need to say any more about that. But that's a kind of practice as research project, which she's working. She's the kind of lead person on the project, but is working collaboratively with other artists outside of the forced entertainment structure. So I think Terry's going to kick off, is that right? And Joe's going to follow in.
Yes, I'll sit over there so I can see the projector.
Okay.
I will speak myself.
Okay. So, Richard Lazelle, you're a hard act to follow. I am going to be talking about 3 areas of work. Initially, I'm going to be talking about some work with forced entertainment and filling you in a little bit about the background of the ensemble. And then I'm going to be talking about 2 other projects which are in fact part of my collaborative research at Roehampton University. So the word intervention has been floated throughout the day, but especially in the last closing 10 minutes. I think the 2 areas that I'm kind of pursuing in the discussion of my work and how it might be relevant to your questions today, the 2 words that I'm pursuing are game and invitation. Although there will also be elements of intervention. Okay, so forced entertainment is an ensemble, as Simon said, and since 1984 now we've continually striven to try and find new performance and theatre forms with which to describe contemporary urban life. The work emerging from our near 30-year experience of making performance together through an organic collaborative methodology has, as Simon said, been the subject of research and teaching within the academy and is also part of the A-level syllabus. I think actually we're quite pleased to think that the work is out there and somehow it's being transformed and reinvented rather than studied. So we hope that that's the spirit of the practice through which it's studied. So these images, there's just a few of them, are photographs of our work. They're taken over the years by our friend and collaborator Hugo Glendinning, somebody we met at university all those years ago, and whose work, reflecting back our practice in this way, has been part of the collaborative conversation for 30 years. So today I'd like to trace connections between durational practice, authorship, participation, and the self, considering different nuances of their relation and different areas of innovation in performing arts practice. I'd like to start with a piece by another artist. In a 2005 project called 1001 Nights Cast, you might know about this, some of you, the artist and performer Barbara Campbell, an Australian, took a phrase from a Beirut newspaper each day as it went to print for a year, longer in fact, and posted it alongside an explicit invitation on the internet for members of the public to write a short story in response. Each story was performed that night as a reading by Campbell as a live webcast on the night of its creation. On the website, Campbell refers us back to the source of her idea, the book 1001 Nights, and she says this: "The 1001 Nights, Kitab Alf Layla wa Layla, Les Mille et Une Nuits, a title in constant motion, endlessly generating more and more versions of itself through translation, extension, and expurgation. On your shelf there may sit a book with this title, but it will not be the book. And on your book's cover there will be no author's name, for it has been written by anonymous storytellers spread over vast terrains and several centuries, made concrete by amanuenses and translators." So in giving you this example, I think I wanted to consider wider questions of originality, lineage, and connection between individuals. Since the turn of the millennium, the proliferation of web technologies enabling users to create easily and share content on digital platforms has offered artists like Campbell, alongside researchers and institutions, a variety of new tools to facilitate shared projects, creating tangible propositions such as this piece, where the individual works playfully in the shadow of a legion of co-authors. Creative ideas around shared or multiple authorship, such as this extraordinary 1001 Nights cast, have wound through and around academic and institutional work on shared authority and its implications, and possibilities for new considerations for the roles of the maker and the viewer. Similarly, practices of verbatim performance, of community curation, of participatory practice in film and the performing arts, and a processual emphasis within a swathe of artworks have seemed to share with various disciplines within the academy certain questions around definitions of expertise, process, knowledge, product, and collaborative methodology. Within the field of performance, there is a further particular focus on the singularity of an event's enactment, the moment and the place of its reception, and I think we really all felt that with Richard, which allows us to foreground subjective and contradictory response as a welcome part of performance work, and correspondingly to redraw the boundaries of intentionality and control within particular works. Some performance pieces, taking place with an audience of one, or in a series of particular sites, or incorporating film or live participation of the audience, or simply in providing the audience with a choice about where to look and what to listen to. These formal essays within the field have led to an expansion of the traditional model of theatrical focus, whereas audience members we might expect to know where we are meant to be looking, and in most cases are aware that what is happening before us is a performative interpretation on stage of an individual playwright or director's vision, message, or intention. These questions of theatre and performance form were well established when we started out in '84, with an expressed desire to work outside of plays and outside of dramatic literature. We were fortunate to have graduated from a drama course that was entirely practice-based, pre-modular, and located in the radical traditions of the 20th century, which Simon touched upon, Brecht, Artaud, Grotowski, Situationism, Alan Caprow and the Happenings movement. This was work that sought, through the last century, to blur life-art boundaries. In a methodology that perhaps held affinities with a fine art education, we studied these models through practice, practicing in the style of. It enabled us to think that a group of people could just decide to make theatre collaboratively, on their feet, using improvisation and conversation in the place of writing and interpretation. That a group or collective was greater artistically than the sum of its parts. That collective pieces proposed contradiction, multiplicity, shifts of register and vision, and dramaturgical drift that were a more suitable aesthetic match for our time. In the recent obituary for Alan Caprow in The Independent, Charles Darwin wrote, "Like many artists of his day, Caprow came to see the fetishizing of works of art as a symptom of capitalist decline. By the late 1950s, the action of action painting was a more important part to him than the painting. 18 Happenings in 6 parts was a moral and political work, unsellable, uncollectible, defying the market. It was also fiercely democratic. Where the situationists held every man to be his own artist, a happening turned him into his own artwork." Caprow and his associate artists, John Cage and George Brecht, had in the 1960s vocalised an element of play within concepts of their work. To Caprow, a happening was a game, an adventure, a number of activities engaged in by participants for the sake of playing. Early on in our 30-year work together, we started to pick up this template of the game. For us, an element discovered by trial and error organically in rehearsal room. It could be that, like Barbara Campbell's 1001 Nights, the game is the overall concept. For us, that would be arrived at through a combination of discussion and improvisation. Or it could be that the piece holds many individual elements of play, with performers tracking in what might in other fields be termed side-by-side play, developing their own vocabularies, their own self-presentations, stealing, swapping, interrupting one another, to make a piece together on a kind of multi-track dramaturgical model. The model or the concept of the game opens a strong but adaptive template for participation and restraint, for renewal and reinvention, for tricking yourself into difference. It could be that it has allowed us as colleagues over such a long period to work playfully with versions of ourselves, switching between truth and perceived truth and fiction and audacity and lies. It could be that this methodology of the game has kept us together and kept us individually committed, everything still to play for, by dodging notions of artistic intentionality, by seeming to follow the organic development of the game itself, by playing with the representation of self as a shifting and experiential texture, the definition of the work, and importantly, the definition of the people, has remained open. Also, maybe, when the game or the conceit of the game is visible, the material event of its play becomes provisional, temporal, undefinitive. Only, but not only, what these people are doing with the game. And then again, only this time, in this place. Tomorrow night they might play it differently. It's a way of thinking about making and maybe being that puts context and relations and time and sight into the frame. In an essay from the Long Now Foundation, the musician, artist and writer Brian Eno says this: Since the beginning of the 20th century, artists have been moving away from an idea of art as something finished, perfect, definitive, and unchanging, towards a view of artworks as processes, or seeds for processes, things that exist and change in time, things that are never finished. In these terms, the game's reception or perception is also an invitation to the audience to shadow our playing with their own internal play. The live unfolding is always ghosted by imagined alternates, versions, variations, alternative possibilities. The game may stay in the imagination of the viewer, a process that stretches beyond the time of the actual event, an imaginative proposition, a frame through which to consider life, time, self, and relations. So I'm going to move on now to one of the actual games. And this is Quizula. This picture, it's probably about 15 years old. I don't know. We started to make this piece of work a long time ago. Quizula is, it's a game. It's usually a 6-hour performance. We must have done it close to 200 times. It starts with a list of 2,000 questions. But we recently did it at the Barbican over 24 hours, taking it in shifts. And for that, a further 3,000 questions were collected by public submission. They're questions that are as broad as we can possibly make them. So they're trivial kind of pursuits questions, quiz questions, personal questions, questions that have been borrowed from literature and from history, and they're all mixed up. So I'd like to read to you a quote from Tim Etchells, the artistic director, in these notes that he published in 1999 about this piece. Questions can be asked in any order, at random or by choice. Questions can be repeated to get a different answer, to get a better answer, to get the same answer, or for any other reason. New questions are made up, and follow-up questions may also be asked. The starting text is simply a catalogue of possibilities, a list of suggestions. Answers given can be true or false. They can be long or short. They can be playful or serious. Lies and mistakes can tell as much about a person as true answers. Lies can be convincing lies, transparent lies, skillfully sold lies, incompetent lies. True answers can sound like untruths. A boring answer might be better sometimes than a supposedly interesting one. Quizula is not interested in true truth, but perhaps in versions of it. Quizula makes one essential demand: play the game. So as a performer, you're making small choices all the time, a balance of experiential playing and a more kind of editorial process of considering what to ask, how to answer, what kind of content or energy or tone to offer. But these decisions are qualified moment by moment by the response of your colleague. So at best, any notion of steering or control is brief, if not altogether illusory. Through these experiential layers of small moments, the larger movements in the piece are produced. Okay, I'm going to show you a little bit
outside
now.
of this room.
This is the Barbican version.
Separate from another person.
It means to say goodbye to them, not live with them anymore, not be their partner.
What does it mean to be separated?
It means to be taken away from that person.
Are you separated?
No,
How many times can a person be separated?
they can be separated from as many people as they have that kind of relationship.
What separates the rich from the poor?
Money,
What are probable things?
things that are likely to happen,
What are inevitable things?
things that are definitely going to happen.
What is the purpose of a sheriff?
Law and order,
What is the purpose of a cop?
more sophisticated law and order.
Is more sophisticated law and order better than a sheriff?
A sheriff was suitable in sheriff times.
What were sheriff times?
I know, the Wild West. Late 19th century.
Where did Robin Hood live?
Nottingham.
Did he live in the Wild West?
No.
Who was his chief adversary?
Friar Tuck.
Okay, so if a question in Quizula elicits not just one particular temporal response, but a catalogue of potential or imagined responses, this framework, a kind of call and response, is picked up by my own research into questions around the edges of collaborative contract in contemporary performance work. And the next two pieces are selected from this creative research at Roehampton University. So as Simon mentioned, the project is called Say the Word, and it's an ongoing creative research project with differently conceived, progressive, small projects through performance and a little bit through written work. I'm working with understandings of collaborative methodologies and their distinctive role as propositions within contemporary arts, not merely as a process, but also as a signification of meaning. I'm also just trying to make good art in a way that draws on my organic and very unoriented experience of practice. So the project started with a series of individual words, which I asked for and which were sent to me by international artists. These words became a trigger for the development of models of collaborative practice, enabling me to question remote and intimate exchange, to look at the form of creative conversation, and to examine structures of intentionality and reciprocity, ownership and agency in collaborative work. All of these projects have involved some variation of call-response experimentation. The first piece I'd like to show you, if it works, was triggered by a word sent by Tim, my colleague in Forced Entertainment. And I think, Tim was definitely being playful here because he sent me the word words. And as a result, I began to think about the power of words to make and unmake a world through listening, and particular to think about games that talk to ideas about the presentation of self and its relation to play. So I want to talk to you about this piece. It's quite an early pilot piece that really got a bit stuck because it involved work with a number of first years at the University of Sheffield, and for me this led to questions about aesthetic and ethical boundaries, and I was left unsure about them. The initial invitation to these students was for them to work with verbal improvisations around a kind of super detailed description of a childhood walk they knew well. I'd tried this idea with an international group of postgrads, MAs in Leeds, and I was intrigued there by a sense of cut-up memory that seemed to cross from rural Scandinavia to cities in Nigeria and India. The Sheffield students were younger though. They didn't have the same relation, it seemed, to walking anywhere as a child, and the terrain they described was pretty similar. In the end, the students themselves decided that they wanted to work with an idea that we'd been playing with as a kind of warm-up idea. The idea was to play with lists of things that they liked and to mix truth and lies. You'll hear that they sound quite young, and that as first years, that they sound quite young, and that their sense of play with the invitation is developing rather than developed. So we worked this idea in two forms. The first was a kind of 2-hour improvisation with the performers lying on the floor and the lights slowly coming up over the 2 hours, revealing the source of the voices. The audience was invited to come and go. They played the improvisation as a group, bouncing the lists backwards and forwards, mindful of playing a game of shifting tone and register. For the second part of the project, I asked them to use their phones to film a kind of minimal visual backdrop to this work, and the students recorded their verbal lists individually in a small, intimate sound booth. Many reported enjoying the process. Some stayed in the booth for longer than 45 minutes, improvising their lists. In the edit room, I didn't allow myself to cut anything they said. That seemed a breach of contract. But I did like the process of overlaying the lists and the play of audibility and clash that resulted. So I grouped the voices together at a beginning point and allowed the overlay to occur by chance. I'm going to play one of the films to you now. I very much like the texture of the voices, the tones of trust in the intimate recording, even the very particular content coming from their age and backgrounds, but I don't think the work with truth and fiction works so well yet. I'm also wary in this project of kind of framing youth, though as I say, the students chose this verbal game themselves. I should say this work was really constrained by time, and if we'd continued to work together as a group, I think they would have grown their own vernacular of play, a making and remaking of themselves, I think, which might have become a kind of life skill of sorts, or a liberty, a way of thinking about themselves which I hope dismantles ideas of persona or type or character or personal narrative, words whose fixity the work seeks to puncture. For these reasons, I'm mulling this piece over rather than thinking about it as a finished piece. Oops, it's that. Oh no! Press the button twice. Hang on. Sorry about this.
I like airports. I like laughing so hard that my stomach hurts.
Teal.
And I can't remember what I was laughing about.
I like politics.
Green.
And can't really make up its mind about what it is. And I guess that's like me.
I like my appearance.
I like just sitting here. It's really relaxing.
I like how when I see my best friend after months of not seeing each other, it's like things never changed and we never moved away from each other.
I like this gold cardigan I'm wearing. It's one of my favourites.
I like watching adverts about third world countries.
I like promising that I'll never leave someone.
I like the fact that my dad was violently attacked because he's gay.
I like having time to think.
I like bonfires and fireworks night.
I like being tall because it makes me feel special.
I like lying on my back in the summer, looking up at the sky and looking at the shapes in the clouds.
I like cooking for myself.
I like the fact my parents are divorced.
The final piece I want to discuss is also part of my research at Roehampton. And this was triggered by the word separation, which was sent by the British playwright Tim Crouch. I went through a number of possibilities with this word before reading a fiction by Lawrence Slater, a book called Spasm, which is a false testimony of sorts. And that seemed to open up the idea of separation from the self or within the self. Soon after, I was approached by a fine artist looking to collaborate on a performative commission by Art Sheffield 10, and it seemed to fit. The fine artist, Becky Shaw, had created an original artwork commissioned by Age Concern, a verbatim recording of 6 meetings between herself and a woman whose speech had been drastically reduced by Alzheimer's. Becky had produced this as a hardback book. The encounters took place in A's home, charting the attempt to hold an ill-fated Christmas party. Becky was at the time visiting 3 people with dementia on the same day of the week for about 3 months, initially trying to involve them in all sorts of art activities. At some point she realised, and I quote, "The whole effort of trying to get A or anyone else to do something or to care for her was the work already, or at least had something important in it that deserved to be communicated. I realised that there were things that June, the care worker, and I do all the time that constitute poor care. We talked over A. We talked about our boyfriends, our clothes, our weekends away. We were at times patronising or just dumb, and it seemed that all over the country people were involved in this act of trying to reach someone with words and actions, and failing. A speaks to us all the time, trying to talk to us of her loneliness and her concerns, but through her unique hodgepodge language of songs. At times we hear and understand, and at times we don't. So in deciding to capture the conversation and our attempt to make her happy by giving her a Christmas lunch, I hope there was something important that would get conveyed and would allow a critical self-reflection on what we expect artists and carers to do. I recorded all the conversations, then wrote them into a play script so that everything of A's identity on the surface is hidden. However, I imagine if one of her relatives heard the text, they would recognise her unique speech. The book emerged as a straightforward way to reproduce the voice without identity, but also allowed the text to be considered alongside other known play texts, for example, Beckett's Mouth. My research around the possibilities for the dramatisation of A, the Christmas Party, concerned finding dramaturgical and ethical templates for performing this challenging art text. How could a performance version duplicate the space and subjectivity of a reader's autonomy with a book? It's hard for me to isolate where the boundaries between aesthetic and ethical considerations on this project lay. It was immediately apparent that an acted version of the text would have been inadequate as a medium for both Becky and I. But for me, this reaction still seems a deep fusion of aesthetic and ethical resistance. I am an unhappy witness to most acting, but the idea of acting these fragments of speech seemed inherently impossible. How could you decide on the delivery of A's speech in any way that was meaningful? Traditional notions of textual interpretation seemed trite, fundamentally a proposal based on the wrong template. So we were left with a question about how a performative embodiment of this encounter could bear witness without the condensation or approximation or reduction that comes with characterization. So we finessed 2 forms where a hold on the audience was loose and a degree of work was required to complete the representation on behalf of the listeners. We evolved an idea of a durational recording for radio, both an attempt to avoid a problematic dramatisation of the situation and as an aesthetic and performative counter to the phasing in and out of the text's comprehensibility. The radio broadcast was organised as a sight reading lasting for 6 hours. It pushed into exhaustion and errors and uncertainty. It was a process of live engagement with the materiality of the text. The turning of the pages was recorded. Performers read the words for the first time, synchronising at some points with lines on the page. The task or work in this performance seemed to resonate with and leave space around the dislocation and unreliability of language in the original meetings. Performance was broadcast over 6 weeks in June by Sheffield Live. The idea of home reception for the piece was also critical. Radio is a site for listening whilst doing, allowing a close but elastic form of engagement and imagining in the intimate space of the home. To this end, the incompleteness of the broadcast as a performance, as a narrative, as a piece of airtime, its unannounced interruption of regular broadcast, its lack of introduction or apology was important to us. Sometime later we revisited the reading as a 6-hour public performance at Roehampton. The audience was free to come and go, free to watch the work of the reading as well as imaginatively piece together a sketch of the events being testified. We decided, Becky and I, that in talking about this piece we didn't want to give quotes from the piece or extracts of the radio, but that we wanted to instead talk to you and to relay some part of our correspondence around the project. Becky wrote to me that she'd always been interested in the boundaries between the acceptable and the unacceptable when working with people. In one of her works called The Generosity Project, ethics and art were directly foregrounded. Becky had won an artist's commission at a residential centre for people with physical disabilities. She says, "The commission assumed that the centre would want me and that they, the commissioners, were giving a gift of art. In response, I gave every willing participant a bunch of flowers, and they gave me the documentation of the moment of reception. The work was intended to question why exactly we expect art to be generous, or benevolent, or indeed ethical." She continues, "I became very interested in the writing of Alan Caprow and how he describes a social meniscus, that people have a kind of skin, and that art tests how far you can push into this social skin. In the 90s and 2000s, there was much socially concerned art that treated people as vulnerable, assuming that people couldn't act for themselves, or were scared of conflict, or needed help. But it seemed to me," this is Becky, "that Caprow's meniscus idea argued for an art that pushed a bit harder, assuming that people could push back. So my idea of ethics is less about protecting people and respecting their space, and more about having a robust intellectual push and shove." I'd like to end with a quote from the French writer Dominique Baquet from her book of 2004, Pour un nouvel art politique. She's talking about providing witness, and she comes up with this great quote, translated from French. "To liberate expression, to provide witnesses to liberate expression and to enable it to circulate, to shed light on the dysfunctional nature of a sick society, to raise awareness and to bear witness, to build perhaps in these moments of grace a being with, être avec." In the 3 works described, I hope that this notion of being with another or others, this être avec, is nuanced as a question or a series of questions, not merely as a piece of content, but written into the form and contract of work between people and its reception. Working through traces, allowing perhaps a trace to last. Thank you.